Dr. James Fine is an economist and policy scientist from Environmental Defense Fund. His research and advocacy includes cap and trade and other market-based policies. He has a PhD from the Energy and Resources Group at University of California, Berkeley, and a BS from the University of Pennsylvania Wharton School. Environmental Defense Fund is a national nonprofit organization of more than 500,000 members dedicated to protecting the environmental rights of all people, including future generations. Dr. Kevin Kennedy works for the California Air Resources Board, or CARB, as the Assistant Executive Officer in the Office of Climate Change. Kevin has a broad responsibility for overseeing the implementation of AB 32. Prior to this appointment, he led the team responsible for evaluating and developing market-based incentives, voluntary actions, offsets, compliance mechanisms, and other approaches for achieving emission reductions in support of AB 32. He also holds a PhD from the Energy and Resources Group at the University of California, Berkeley, and has more than 20 years' experience in energy and environmental policy. Also with us today is Carter Brooks, Climate Earth's VP and co-founder, who will moderate the Q&A. The presentation will take about 35 minutes, and then we will take your questions. And now I'm pleased to introduce Dr. James Fine.
Thank you, Frankie. And thank you all, conference participants, for your interest in this topic today. As Frankie mentioned in his introduction to me, I'm an economist in policy science and environmental defense fund. I wanted to mention briefly that EDF has over 100,000 members in California. We also have teams of policy analysts on the topic of climate change. I'm in the state climate program. We have national and international teams as well. And so we are looking at this issue not just from the perspective of California, but as very much a California stepping stone towards national and then international climate policy. On to the next slide. I thought I'd start by just setting up the very basic objectives of AB 32, or so-called California's Global Warming Solutions Act. First, we have a very clear goal for environmental performance established in that act. It's a 2020 emissions cap. It says our emissions of greenhouse gases must be back down to 1990 levels by 2020. Since 1990, our emissions have grown. So this represents about a 30% decline from current levels. You'll see that visually in the next slide. I'll mention that subsequently Governor Schwarzenegger, by executive order, established a 2050 emissions cap that is 80% below 1990. That, from our perspective, is very much an ecological goal. That's what we need to be aiming towards. And thus the 2020 set of goals and actions we'll be taking are really initial forays into reducing the carbon intensity of California's economy as we proceed towards the definitely more aggressive and challenging 2050 goal. I'll mention one third other attribute of AB 32, and that is the community protections and benefits language. EDF was a sponsor of AB 32. We're very proud of the bill, including the language that speaks directly to communities. So AB 32 requirements include relying on a well-designed cap-and-trade program that does more than simply protect our communities, but in fact brings direct benefit to communities. Here we're particularly concerned about low-income communities and environmental justice communities, oftentimes considered synonymous, but not in every case. What the low-income component means is that we can't make things worse off for people who will feel the expectation of rising energy prices, and this is particularly a concern for low-income households that tend to spend a higher proportion of their budget on carbon-intensive goods and services. The second piece of that goal is to make sure air quality doesn't get worse off in areas where air quality is already problematic. That is, communities that already are disproportionately burdened by high levels of air pollution cannot see that air pollution worsen in a climate policy regime where we, by design, give businesses the flexibility to choose the best strategy that they want to implement to meet their regulatory compliance objectives. So going on to slide 3, you can see graphically the set of goals we've set here in AB 32. A 30% decline by 2020 from business as usual trajectories. So the blue line you see is a trajectory for greenhouse gas emissions for the state of California if we don't do anything to change that trajectory. Indeed, over the last couple of years, we maybe have seen a bit of a bump in that trajectory due to our current economic climate. But nevertheless, there's every reason to believe that we will eventually be back on course of the business-as-usual blue line trajectory unless we implement the measures that are in AB 32. So the overall goal for 2020 is achieving about 169 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions reductions. That's a bit of a term of art, MTCO2E, as you see it on your screen. And that stands, again, for million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent greenhouse gas reductions. Carbon dioxide equivalent is a way of referring to all types of greenhouse gas emissions that could come from our economy. We use equivalents to carbon dioxide because that is essentially the primary global warming gas that we're most familiar with. I want to highlight some work done by the California Resources Board as it developed its plan last year to meet the 2020 goals established in AB 32. As part of that planning effort, CARB was required to analyze the economic effects of the program. I'm delighted to have Kevin Kennedy on this webinar today since he was the one who led that analytical effort. He can certainly speak more directly to it than I can. I can give you the overarching take-home messages from the work. What you see in your slide here are 3 bars on one graph. 2007 real output, that is gross state product, economic activity from California. Gross state product, or you might be more familiar with the term gross domestic product, or GDP, is a coarse measure of the productivity of an economy. It certainly has its limitations as a descriptive measure, but it's a good starting point when we want to evaluate the effects of any policy on an overall economy. So what you see in the 2 right-hand bars are 2020 business as usual and 2020 gross state product under AB 32 measures. And you see very quickly that there isn't a big difference between the 2 2020 bars. So the take-home message here is that our economic analyses, which was state of the science of the time, suggest that we won't see a big impact to our economy as a result of AB 32. It's as likely to be positive as it is to be negative. If you are a climate skeptic or a modeling skeptic, you'll believe that maybe it will be a slight drag on our economy. Environmental Defense Fund last year actually produced a report where we studied about 7 of the national leading economic studies of climate policy and its impacts on the national economy. And the upshot of those studies is that they kind of all fall in a range of plus or minus 2% impact on gross domestic product, with an average finding of a slight increase of about 0.5% higher GDP in 2020 as a result of climate policy. So to put that in perspective, instead, if instead of meeting our business as usual gross national product in January 1, 2020, we'll be meeting that in, if you're a skeptic, March or April of 2020, and if you're optimistic about what climate policy will do, we'll be meeting that level of productivity in, say, November of 2019. So not a big difference is the take-home message here. I'll mention also that these studies do look at the costs of complying, that is, costs of achieving reductions. They consider the net benefits or the benefits of these actions, such as avoided energy bills or avoided purchase of gasoline. So what you're seeing here are net economic effects to the economy. These studies do not include the costs of the worst effects of global warming. And so by implementing our policy and being among the leaders nationally and in the world of leading towards an international climate regime, we will be reducing the likelihood of incurring the cost of the worst effects of global warming, and that avoided cost is not included in the calculus that you see here. And that's another reason why we conclude quite confidently that we're likely to see net positive benefits from climate policy going forward.